In 2011, when NATO sent their air forces into Libya, one of their first actions was to bomb a factory making concrete piping for the Great Man-Made River Project. And when I say this pipeline is massive, I mean it's the largest irrigation system in the world. This concept of not allowing other countries to develop goes back to Britain, but it really goes back to the mercantile policies of all European powers in their colonies at this time. Western imperialism is all about keeping other countries undeveloped. The Brits and Americans, who more or less engineered this system, have certain countries who they've allowed to be on the team for varying geopolitical reasons. So even though their clique is centered around Western Europe, it also includes the likes of Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. These countries have been permitted to develop and prosper. Other global South nations have not been allowed to do so. And they use both economic sabotage as well as wage military campaigns in order to keep those other countries from developing. Now, this concept of not allowing other countries to develop once you've already developed goes back to Britain, which is widely recognized as the first country to industrialize in the world. But it really goes back to the mercantile policies of all European powers in their colonies at this time. And this is not just me saying this. This is Tom Ritchie saying it. Tom Ritchie's a YouTuber who's also a history teacher who helps students prepare for the advanced placement history tests in the United States. He teaches to a standardized test put out by the US government. So, unlike me, he's as mainstream as they come and as in line with the Western establishment's historical narratives as you can be. And I've learned a lot from him, don't get me wrong. I like his channel. But my point is that he reflects the establishment viewpoint. So here's what Tom has to say regarding what colonialism is.
So the whole point here is that you create really a market, and whether it's French colonies, whether it's English colonies, where the colonies provide raw materials, and in return, they consume finished goods made in the other country. So you've got a system of internal trade that replaces a system of external trade, which would be the alternative. So this is the whole point of colonies. Maybe you're understanding this, especially if you're looking at this in the context of U.S. history.
So he says this is the whole point of colonies. That is, their whole point was to provide raw materials to their colonizer and also to buy the manufactured goods from the colonizer. And he also says specifically that this is what Britain was doing with its American colonies. Britain's aim was to keep the American colonies undeveloped and without sophisticated manufacturing capabilities. Knowing that, is it really so far-fetched to think that the US didn't decide to employ the same system on other countries once it became powerful enough to do so? Not at all. And in fact, that's what the US government and its Western European partners are doing. Now, as a side note to leftists, it is completely and entirely inaccurate to paint the US with a broad stroke throughout its 250-year history. In the 1800s, there was a very strong pro-development political faction that held the White House and Congress at certain points in time, and maybe for about half of the century. And that same pro-development faction tended to be anti-imperialist, and much more so than you think. Example, John Adams, at the behest of Alexander Hamilton, treated the revolutionary government in Haiti as a sovereign nation and traded with them on equal terms. But anti-industrialist Thomas Jefferson shut off ties with Haiti when he came to power 3 years later. And then he went ahead and placed a trade embargo on them. 60 years after that, And really, as soon as the southern states had left the Union, and as soon as their representatives had left the Union's Congress, Abe Lincoln re-established relations with Haiti. The timing of this was not a coincidence whatsoever. And that's just one example of what this pro-development political faction was all about in the 19th century. However, since the killing of JFK, the US has been absolutely dominated by imperialist policy. And its goal since then has been to keep the global South undeveloped. The concept of producing high tech at home and extracting raw materials from outside came from following the example of past colonial empires, and from watching Britain in the early 1800s as it morphed its strategy for the Americas into an imperialist strategy rather than a territorial colonial strategy. That's why you not only had anti-imperialist Haiti sending troops to assist Simón Bolívar in his revolt against the Spanish crown, you also had Britain sending troops and arms to Bolívar. They weren't interested in colonizing Venezuela and Colombia. They simply wanted to break up Spain's colonies so that they could dominate trade in the Americas. And Gran Colombia was straddled with British debt from its very first years as a nation. I very much fault Bolívar with allowing that to happen. He was a better revolutionary than statesman. But regardless, the British got what they wanted. So the imperialist strategy and example had already been set by the British for use by the US once it became a world power at the turn of the 20th century. From there, it was really just a copy and paste job. In today's world, it's slightly more complex than when the British were running the show. For example, today, it's an entire clique of imperialist countries, rather than just one country. The US is obviously the most powerful Western nation, but it has partner countries in its clique, and together as a team, they dominate the rest of the world. All of these team members design high tech and extract undeveloped countries' raw resources without paying barely anything. The more recent additions to the clique, such as Taiwan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia, were permitted to develop. Other non-Western nations are not. And that's the whole system. That's the entire game plan. When you see the US sanctioning another country, sending aircraft to bomb them, or engineering a UN or NATO peace mission, as they're currently doing in Haiti with brown-skinned Kenyan soldiers, it's usually about keeping them from developing. If they develop, the Western core, essentially the US and Western Europe, will lose some of its global control. They want to stay in control of the world and be the dominant force. And that's honestly all they want. It actually muddies the waters when leftists, or usually leftists, but anti-imperialists say that they want control so that they can set the policies. No, that's actually misleading. The thing is, it's not as if the Western clique has any agenda beyond domination and control. Control is the agenda. If they're in the driver's seat, then they're accomplishing their goal. It's really that simple, unfortunately. And they figured out centuries ago that the way to stay in control and to be the dominant force is to keep everyone else undeveloped. Without high-tech capability and with cheap raw resources for export. So while the imperialist team has grown and there are nuances to their system that weren't there in the 1700s, the essence of the game plan is the same as what Tom Ritchie described regarding European colonizers and their colonies. And While there tends to be acknowledgement of certain imperialist actions, such as the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the sanctions on Cuba, and maybe CIA coups in the 1960s, 70s, maybe even 80s, there fails to be any acknowledgement of dozens of other current imperialist wars, sanctions, economic sabotage, peacekeeping missions, currency traps, and debt traps going on all around the globe. For those who think, for instance, that Gaddafi was an evil tyrant who needed to be taken out for the sake of the Libyan people, I recommend you start viewing the news with this definition of Western imperialism in mind. Because in 2011, when NATO sent their air forces into Libya, one of their first actions was to bomb a factory making concrete piping for the Great Man-Made River Project, which is a massive pipeline providing 70% of Libyans with their water from a deep underground reservoir. And then they proceeded to bomb segments of the pipeline itself. And when I say this pipeline is massive, I mean it's the largest irrigation system in the world, per the Guinness Book of World Records from 2008. So this was a Gaddafi project that had taken decades to construct. It was already providing drinking water to the nation, to Libya, and they were just 4 years away from completing their fifth and final phase, which would have created large-scale agricultural production all throughout Libya. Not only that, but Gaddafi wanted to send Libyan engineers out as consultants to countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and Chad in order to eventually green their deserts as well. Because those 4 countries are all sitting on top of a massive water reservoir 500 meters below the surface. Meaning Gaddafi was going to completely transform the region into a breadbasket. But at this point, that'll never happen, and the infrastructure of the pipeline within Libya itself is deteriorating every year, ever since NATO took Gaddafi out. And Libyan cities are now dealing again with drinking water difficulties for the first time since the Great Man-Made River Project went online. Still think that NATO mission was for human rights? It's like that in almost every situation you come across in the news. Everything you see occurring out there in the world will start making a whole lot more sense once you realize that it likely has something to do with the Western clique attempting to assert its dominance over other nations. Now, for those leftists who have recently changed the definition of imperialism to fit the conditions of Western-style imperialism, don't. Unlike the wishy-washy words socialism, capitalism, fascism, imperialism has a concrete definition. And nowhere in that definition does it mention preventing other nations from developing. If you're looking for a term to describe the type of imperialism that seeks to keep the dominated country undeveloped, then you can call it Western imperialism from now on, now that you understand Western imperialism's defining feature. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Pass my videos on to friends who might be interested, and help me grow so I can eventually make this a full-time job. I'll see you in the next video.